Hey guys, I wanted to do a quick showcase and guide of a build I made that I haven't seen before, and that's a Path of Flames Reap Frostfire Gemma. The build has the potential to do all content in the game with more investment. On day 3, I got it to about a billion DPS with about 300 FE, and it's currently sitting at about 2 to 3 billion with probably 600 FE invested, and there's still so many more upgrades I can make. Not only does it have that much damage, but it's also tanky, fast, and doesn't require any crazy 1000 FE items to get started. That said, it's not a simple build, and to get it to work right, you need to use skills in the right order, maintain certain skill up times, and make sure you have some very specific lines on some certain gear pieces. In the back here, I'm showing just a normal T7 map to give you an idea of what the clear looks like in easier content, and I'll show some T8 and bosses later on. So the main idea of this build is to constantly be channeling Path of Flames as our main damage over time source that we reap from, and then proc constant reaps using Thundercloud and a castwall channeling setup. I haven't seen many builds utilize Thundercloud as a reaping source, but I believe it's one of the best for a multitude of builds. It's built around a few main legendaries that will only work with Path of Flames, since it's both the channeling skill and our main means of movement, so we never have to stop channeling it while mapping. I wouldn't recommend starting the build without having these, but it can still function without them. The first legendary is Supreme Throne, which with 2 channeling skills, Path of Flame and Thundercloud, we have pretty much 100% uptime of 10 throne stacks. And these stacks were changed sometime recently, now granting 8% additional channeled skill damage and 5% less additional damage taken per stack. That means we effectively have a permanent 80% additional damage and 50% less damage taken at all times. And keep in mind, this is also a one-handed wand, so we can use another wand for stats as well. The next important legendary is Manilla's Mist, with specifically the Corroded Reap line, which allows you to reap 1 second of dot every 1 second, as long as the enemy's weakened. And there are a couple ways to make sure the enemy's always weakened, but since we're channeling Path of Flames, the best way to do it is using a castwall channeling setup with Shadow Shot. So if we place a Shadow Swamp somewhere in the map, then every time Shadow Shot hits an enemy, it'll move that Shadow Swamp and refresh the duration. Since we're always channeling, we're always proccing these Shadow Shots, so pretty much every enemy is always weakened. On top of that, both Shadow Shot and Shadow Swamp can be linked to Reaping Agony, giving 2 more sources of reap while we're just running around channeling Path of Flames. Since the enemy's always weakened, we need another way to make sure they're getting constantly hit to proc those reaps. And since we have a few sources of reap CDR from our boots and passives, we need to be hitting much faster than the 1 second cooldown that Manilla's Mist normally has. To solve this, I'm using a Thundercloud setup linked to Lightning to Cold for a couple reasons. First, it can constantly hit enemies around us and proc reaps from many sources. Second, it can freeze enemies, which resets the cooldown of our Frigid Transmission, allowing us to move faster in maps and do more damage because of the Frostfire trait that scales off cold damage or cold spells cast recently. Also, Thundercloud can proc Thunder Imbue, which we use as yet another source of automated reap. So to reiterate, while we're channeling Path of Flames and have Thundercloud up, we are reaping the dot of Path of Flames from Thundercloud hits, Thunder Imbue hits, Shadow Shot hits, Frigid Transmission, Shadow Swamp placements, Manilla's, and then any other source from gear or passives that we have. Since Path of Flames constantly reapplies its dot, we can reap it as many times as we want with the Reap Purification passive and not lose any damage like you would with something like Wilt. As for the defenses of the build, we have an additional 50% reduced damage taken from Supreme Throne stacks, 20% reduced damage taken from our helmet, since we're constantly cursing, which can go down to 30% with the Corrosion, and 20% reduced damage taken from cursed enemies from our passives. I'm using a Hybrid Life ES setup with some regain and regen, but it would probably be better to do a full Energy Shield version with Twilight Vestment or some other method of regen. Now I'll go over each of the gear pieces and explain why they're used. Note that this is my current gear, so it's a little more expensive than the 300 FE I talked about, but I'm also doing closer to 3 billion DPS. For the helmet, I'm using Hecate's Vision because we are constantly cursing, so it's just a great all-around helmet. There are many corrosions you can get on it as well, like 2 curses, 30% damage taken and damage reduced, and I think some others. This helmet base currently costs about 30 to 40 FE. For the chest piece, I crafted my own piece with just tankiness and explode for better clear, but you can also get explode from passives or other means, and it's not 100% necessary. You can craft a similar chest without the explode for probably about 50 FE, I don't even need the cold res on this. I'm really overcapped because of my ring, so it should be erosion or some other resistance. For the amulet, we use Manila's Mist to push the damage really high, but you can also use Magnus's Mind Flame for the explode passive, or just a crafted amulet with something like Affliction effect and level of fire spells. This is our most expensive item, probably, along with the gloves, and it's usually around 80 to 100 for the correct corrosion. For the gloves, we make great use of all the stats on Sage's Insight because we deal 3 elemental types, with Path of Flames dealing fire, Thundercloud dealing lightning and cold, and then other sources also dealing cold, like our Frigid Transmission. This item is usually around 80 to 100 FE, but it's well worth it for the damage we gain from it. And you can also get the Corrosion for extra fire res reduction, or more elemental spell levels. For the boots, we use Feline Steps because of the Reap cooldown effect, and helping us generate agility blessings. The Corrosion here is also really helpful if you want to get the one that also scales Reap duration with focus stacks, and you can get the focus stacks from the passives as well. For the belt, I'm using an Infinity with a good passive, an agility blessing, some extra resistance, and some skill duration. This slot is really open to whatever you want, but I have a list here of some passives that help the belt a lot. The one that I went for was Waiting Attack, because it works really well with agility blessings that we stack in our build and with Path of Flames. And the way it works with Path of Flames is that it only consumes the charges when you first start channeling Path of Flames, and then it gains the benefit of the additional damage while you're channeling it, which means every time we stop channeling to cast our Thundercloud or to use our Frigid Transmission, it'll consume the charges and then start stacking them up again while giving us the damage of Path of Flames. And since we reap so often from Manila's Mist and our other reaping sources, we charge up those 6 stacks right away. And the reason that you want skill duration on the belt is because it helps the Thundercloud uptime, the Shadow Swamp uptime, just in case there aren't any enemies around and you actually expire the Shadow Swamp, and our Frostfire Rampage uptime, which is our hero trait. And I think this belt cost me 15, 20 FE. Really, again, you can get any stats that you need on this belt. For the rings, I'm using one crafted ring to cover my resistances, mostly erosion resistance, as well as some extra life and regen. And then a Restless Glacier, since we're always inflicting Frostbite with Thundercloud, and a Frostfire Gemma makes that cold damage also apply to fire. The Glacial Ring costs about 60 FE when I bought it, and the crafted one cost me kind of a lot because of the elemental and erosion resist line, but you can make a pretty good ring for probably 30 to 40 FE. As for the weapons, I'm using one Supreme Throne, and the most important thing here is that the last line needs to be only 1 stack lost on non-crit, or we will lose stacks too fast and not go up to 10. The other lines don't matter too much. I just opted for a channeled stack Corrosion since it was cheap, and it lets me reach max stacks faster for Thundercloud. Max stacks don't really matter on this build because there's a version of Supreme Throne that gives you extra max stacks. In fact, it almost makes it worse in a way because it takes longer to get up to max stacks, and you can only gain throne stacks while you're at max. The weapon that I got here was about 40 FE, and then I just corroded it. But without the corrosion, it's still about 40 FE, and you don't need the corrosion at all. The other wand, I'm just using a crafted wand, where the most important lines are probably the Affliction effect and then the fire level of spells. And all the prefixes can really be anything, since Frostfire Gemma benefits from fire damage, cold damage, lightning damage, spell damage, dot damage. So really you can get anything here. I just got the Elemental Pen because I wanted to throw a Restless Ember at it, and that's what I got. So without that line, it probably costs about 80 FE to craft after buying a +2 base for about 10 FE or so. For our hero traits, we're just using Glacial Flames and Icefire Embrace for the extra fusion energy. And then we're taking Extreme Fusion so that our Thundercloud can clear trash mobs more effectively, and then we don't lose energy at the end of Rampage. For the hero memories, I just took some fusion energy and move speed ones. You should really upgrade these to +2 fusion energy, which are about 40 FE or so. I just haven't gotten around to it. And then you can also cover your resistances here, or do like I did and get more move speed. For the Relic, this really should be like a Void Eater, or one with some fusion energy effect, or the class-specific legendary. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. For the passives, I opted to start with Goddess of Knowledge first, because Burning Touch is so broken on Frostfire Gemma, since it gives us 40% fire damage effectively, since it converts the cold damage to fire. And then for the other passive, we have to take the spell damage one, since the frost damage taken by enemies doesn't actually work for Frostfire Gemma for fire conversion. And then here are the other nodes that I took on the tree. Next, I took Spirit Color, just because Translucent, again, is such a crazy node for Frostfire Gemma. Since we are dealing all 3 damage types pretty much all the time, then we benefit from every single one of these elements. So we end up getting 60% additional fire damage as long as we take the last hero trait that gives us lightning damage as well. As for the other node, we just take the extra 25% damage since enemies are always shocked and frostbitten by Thundercloud. And then here are the other nodes that I took in this tree. Lastly, I went for Psychic because Reap Purification is mandatory in this build. You could get it on your Infinity as well, but I also wanted the other node that gives Curse Immunity and reduced damage taken. And the other nodes are very helpful on this tree, giving more Reap CDR and duration. For my Pact Spirits, I'm just taking most of the generic nodes on the right and bottom, and then on the left, I'm using a legendary dot damage Pact Spirit that I got lucky with, which just gives me Affliction effect and some skill duration, which is nice, but it's really not necessary since we do get a lot of Affliction effect from our passive tree, ring, and wand. And we also generate a lot of Affliction from our precise Deep Pain, and we also run Cataclysm on a few spells. Now going into our skills, we have our main Path of Flame set up with just damage supports as well as Affliction generation, and Guard, which gives us both damage and generates a barrier every time we restart channeling it, which means that every time we dash or refresh Thundercloud, we'll get a barrier if ours has expired. Entangled Pain is our curse, which we link to Terrain of Malice and Abysmal Hatred, so that it follows us around and is pretty much permanently active. Our helmet also makes the AoE much larger, and then both our helmet and our passives make us take much less damage from things that we curse. And I'm still unsure if this curse or Elemental Destruction is more damage, since it's kind of hard to test minus res on dummies. But I just felt like this one was a decent one to use, so that's what I'm going with. Frigid Transmission lets us both move around fast, since its cooldown gets reset when Thundercloud freezes enemies, and it also generates stacks for our hero trait that gives more damage when we cast a cold spell. We can also put Reaping Agony on it and cast it every 2 to 3 seconds for yet another source of Reap. Shadow Swamp is used with our cast while channeling Shadow Shot setup in order to reap enemies with Reaping Agony when it's placed down, and also generate Affliction over time with Cataclysm. And it also weakens enemies, which allows Thundercloud to constantly reap them every 1 second. Thundercloud I explained a bit earlier, but it enables many reaping sources like Manella's, the Thunder Imbue, its own Reaping Agony, and then it's also used just to clear trash around the map, as well as keep uptime on our throne stacks. And the Lightning to Cold support allows it to inflict Frostbite, which helps our ring and also freezes enemies for our Frigid Transmission to reset cooldown. For the other supports, I'm using Added Fire so that it ignites and gets a bit more damage, as well as Channel Preparation so that it's easier to get it up to 5 stacks. I should also mention here that you can use a King Lionheart's Ambition musket if you want to do an Ignite version of this build, in which Thundercloud is pretty much the main damage source, and Path of Flames is only used to enable the cast while channeling. And this build is probably better at clearing T7s than the Path of Flames Reap build, but it will not be able to scale as hard and do harder content. For our auras, we are running Thunder Imbue with Imbue Enhancement and Reaping Agony. And the reason we run Imbue Enhancement is because we don't actually care about the buff effect of this Imbue, we only care about the fact that it's an extra Reap source, since it attacks every 0.3 seconds while we have Thundercloud up. We're also running a Precise Deep Pain, which is just extra dot damage and then more afflictions per second with the Precise version, as well as the Elemental Amplification, which just gives more elemental damage. I'm running those with a Restraint since my mana was a little tight, as well as Magical Source, about level 13 to 14. And if you get a higher level Restraint, you can also fit in a Swiftness here. It's just hard to get the energy. You need to max out all your gear. Lastly, we're running the Cast While Channeling setup, which, as I said earlier, was Shadow Shot linked with Reaping Agony as well as GMP. I tried out some other versions using frost spells in here, like Ice Lance, But if you go that route, then I wouldn't recommend using the Manila's Mist unless you can find another way to weaken enemies. Now I want to go over some of the mechanics of the build and how to play it during bossing and mapping. When you're fighting a boss, you want to first channel your Thundercloud to max stacks, which for me is instant since I have 5 initial channeled stacks. You want to make sure that Thundercloud is always at max stacks during bosses, so you'll have to recast it every 5 or 6 seconds. You also need to place down a Shadow Swamp somewhere, which will only last for 5 or so seconds if you aren't hitting any enemies, so make sure it doesn't despawn on you during bosses, since that's your main source of weaken. Once you've done both of those things, you're free to run into the boss and hit your curse, making sure that the boss is always standing on your path somewhere, and that you're close enough to be hitting him with Thundercloud. The reason I have some skill radius on my wand is because it increases the activation range of Thundercloud, letting me be just slightly further away and still hitting enemies. So I'll do a quick demonstration of what it actually looks like. You see I hit the boss for about 10 seconds, and then I'm letting it go to find the actual average DPS. And this does no damage right now, so. You can see at about 25, 26 seconds it started dropping, meaning we're at about 2.5-ish billion DPS at the moment. For mapping, the rotation is pretty much the same. You just need to make sure that you set down a Shadow Swamp somewhere at the start of the map, and that your Thundercloud stacks don't drop to 0 ever. But other than that, you don't really need to worry about keeping them maxed out, since nothing really is going to kill you, so it doesn't matter if your throne stacks drop down. And if you ever go 5 seconds or so without hitting an enemy, you'll notice that the Shadow Swamp disappears. So when that happens, you do need to recast it somewhere, since it won't just appear by itself randomly. And if you're killing enemies fast enough, if you're freezing enemies fast enough, then you can actually just dash through the map, since your Thundercloud is freezing enemies and resetting the cooldown of your frigid transmission. So it can actually be quite a fast mapper. And then you'll notice that any rare enemy or boss we run over pretty much dies in one hit, which is really satisfying to see. That's the end of this build guide. Thanks for sticking around at the end. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions on how to make the build better, then please let me know. I'll try to reply as fast as I can. And I hope you guys like the build. Thanks.